The most disturbing case ever revealed in the US forced him to be his mother's husband. This phrase echoed through the corridors of the Louisville court, Kentucky, in March 1963, when one of the most shocking cases of consanguinity already documented in American history came to light. It emerged from the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where geographical isolation had created closed communities for generations. For over 4 decades, the Harrington family had lived in absolute secret. Our understanding of the limits of human degradation would be forever changed by what happened on this rural property of 200 acres. Just 16 years old in 1943, Thomas Harrington was forced by his own father, Jeremiah Harrington, to assume marital responsibilities with his mother, Martha, after the patriarch's premature death in a mining accident. A distorted tradition of maintaining pure lineage was what began this story, but it turned into the most unimaginable nightmare a family could live. Hidden between centenary oak-covered hills and surrounded by a constant mist that seemed to protect its darker secrets, the Harrington property was 15 kilometers from the nearest city, Pineville. There, far from the eyes of society, 3 generations lived under rules created by the family's founder, Ezekiel Harrington, who arrived in the region in 1897 obsessed with preserving what he called blood purity. Having lost her husband in a collapse in the local coal mine in 1943, Martha Harrington, then 34, was trapped in the family traditions imposed by her deceased father-in-law, with 5 children to raise and without financial resources. The eldest son, Thomas, was chosen to assume the role of family protector, a cruel euphemism for what would really happen over the next 20 years. A shy, blue-eyed boy with brown hair, described by neighbors as such, young Thomas had no choice. An environment where resistance was impossible was created by the social pressures of the time, combined with geographical isolation and financial dependence. A union that violated all known social and moral norms was what he was forced to accept. Appearances were managed by the family during the early years. While Martha took care of her younger children, Thomas worked on the small family farm, cultivating corn and raising some cattle. To the few neighbors who occasionally visited, they were merely a mother and son struggling to survive after a tragedy. But the truth was much more disturbing. Her first child with Thomas had been born to Martha in 1945. A girl, called Sarah, was born with severe facial deformities and learning difficulties. The devastating effects of consanguinity were already indicated by her physical characteristics: very close eyes, a cleft palate, and compromised mental development. A boy named David was born in 1947, the second child, who developed chronic breathing problems and frequent seizures. More and more evidently, the effects of endogamy began to manifest itself, but the family remained isolated, without access to appropriate medical care or external orientation. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. These are stories that society preferred to forget but need to be told to understand the limits of human degradation. By 1950, 7 years after the beginning of this forced union, the effects of consanguinity on the Harrington family had become impossible to ignore. 4 children with Thomas had been born to Martha, now 41, each with deformities and health problems more severe than the previous one. The third child, Michael, was born in 1949, a child who could never walk properly due to malformations in his lower limbs. His legs were disproportionate to his body, and a condition known as syndactyly, common in cases of nearby consanguineous relationships, affected his feet, which had fused toes. In 1952, Rebecca, the 4th child, was born with severe microcephaly. Significantly smaller than normal, her head indicated compromised brain development. She never learned to talk or feed herself, remaining in a vegetative state throughout her brief life of just 8 years. Now 23, Thomas began to show signs of mental deterioration. The psychological weight of his situation, combined with the pressure to support a family under such adverse conditions, was charging its price. Episodes of erratic behavior developed by him alternated between periods of absolute silence and explosions of anger directed at his own children. A scenario of progressive isolation had become the Harrington property. Rarely did the children leave the farm, and when they did, hats and clothes that hid their deformities were worn by them. A rigid control system was developed by Martha, prohibiting any interaction with strangers and keeping the children busy with housework to prevent them from exploring beyond the property's limits. In 1953, an unannounced visit to Harrington Farm was made by the local church pastor, Reverend William Patterson. He was deeply disturbed by what he found: children with obvious deformities, precarious living conditions, and an environment loaded with tension and fear. While Martha explained the children's conditions as God's will, something in the family's behavior warned the religious man. A physical resemblance between Thomas and the younger children was noticed by Reverend Patterson, much more than would be expected in a half-sibling relationship. The characteristic blue eyes of the family appeared more intensely, and certain birthmarks were statistically impossible in a normal family. During this visit, Rebecca had one of her seizures common in children with severe microcephaly. Medical help was offered by the Reverend, but Martha refused categorically, claiming that doctors did not understand the family's special condition. Even more suspicions about what was really happening on that isolated property were raised by this refusal. Local church records indicate that Reverend Patterson tried to make more visits in the following months, but the family was always found to be absent or too busy to receive him. Theories about family curses and divine punishments began to be murmured by the religious community of the region regarding the Harringtons. In 1954, the fifth child, James, was born, presenting the most severe set of deformities yet seen in the family. Each of his hands had only 3 fingers. Heterochromia, meaning his eyes were different colors, was present, and he developed a cardiac condition that severely limited his physical activities. Rarely crying or showing emotions, James remained in a state of apathy that worried even Martha. A severe drought brought to Kentucky in 1958 forced many rural families to seek government help. Having been able to stay isolated for 15 years, the Harrington family finally had to interact with external authorities when Martha was forced to request food assistance at the Pineville Social Services office. The social worker responsible for the case, Dorothy Mills, a 45-year-old graduate of the University of Louisville, was immediately alert when she first saw the Harrington children. Patterns she had studied in cases of consanguinity during her academic background were consistent with their physical deformities. Not only facial deformities but also a characteristic speech pattern of severe intellectual disability were noted by Dorothy in Sarah, now 13. David, 11, breathed with difficulty and had frequent fainting episodes. Michael, 9, needed support to walk, and James, 4, remained completely apathetic throughout the interview. During the routine investigation to approve social assistance, inconsistencies in family documents were discovered by Dorothy. Thomas was listed as the father on the birth records of the youngest children, but no marriage record for Thomas existed. When asked about the children's mother, contradictory and evasive explanations were given by Martha. Unannounced home visits to evaluate the family's living conditions were decided upon by the social worker. On her first visit in September 1958, she found Thomas and Martha sharing the same room, while the 5 children slept in a room without proper ventilation. A marital relationship between mother and son was clearly suggested by the configuration of the house. Martha was confronted by Dorothy about the situation, but she received only vehement denials and threats that the family would move if she continued her persecution. However, a case of consanguinity and child neglect was what the social worker now suspected she was facing. It was during this investigation that something even more disturbing was discovered by Dorothy. Talking to James, the 4-year-old repeated a phrase he had heard from the adults: "Dad Thomas is Mom Martha's brother." The social worker's suspicions about the true nature of the family relationship were confirmed by this innocent revelation from a child. The moment you hear an innocent child repeat words that reveal the horror of your own existence is when you realize that some secrets are too heavy to be buried. Leave a comment telling me which part of this story has most impacted you so far. The local sheriff, Robert Kane, a 52-year-old man who had served the community for over 2 decades, was immediately contacted by Dorothy Mills. When she shared her discovery, the sheriff initially showed resistance to believing the severity of the situation. While cases of consanguinity were whispered about in rural communities, they were rarely officially investigated. But the evidence presented by Dorothy was too convincing to be ignored. A disturbing picture that demanded immediate investigation was painted by the children's deformities, combined with the domestic configuration and James's innocent statement. In October 1958, a search warrant to officially investigate the Harrington property was obtained by Sheriff Robert Kane. They arrived at the farm on a hazy morning that seemed to mirror the dark atmosphere they would find, accompanied by social worker Dorothy Mills and county doctor Dr. Henry Morrison. Critical to documenting the children's conditions was Dr. Morrison, a graduate of the University of Kentucky School of Medicine with experience in basic genetics. A consistent pattern of congenital malformations he described as textbook examples of inbreeding depression was revealed by his examination. Now 13, Sarah had not only severe facial deformities but also progressive scoliosis that was compromising her respiratory capacity. That her mental age corresponded approximately to that of a 6-year-old child and that she had developed repetitive behaviors characteristic of autistic spectrum disorders were documented by Dr. Morrison. At age 11, David was diagnosed with a congenital cardiac condition that severely limited his life expectancy. His lungs were underdeveloped, and he had episodes of cyanosis, a bluish skin color indicative of inadequate blood oxygenation. Without medical intervention, David would not live beyond 15 years, estimated Dr. Morrison. Michael, 9 years old, had such severe bone malformations that Dr. Morrison recommended multiple surgeries, procedures simply not available in Kentucky's rural medicine in 1958. His legs were of different lengths, and his hips were misaligned in a way that caused constant pain. The most complex set of medical problems was found in James, the youngest at 4. In addition to visible physical deformities, Dr. Morrison found that he had mild hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid in the brain, which explained his extremely limited mental development and constant apathy. Under legal pressure and in the face of irrefutable medical evidence, Martha finally confessed to the true nature of her relationship with Thomas. She admitted that after her husband's death in 1943, she had been forced by circumstances and family traditions to maintain a union with her own son. Now 31, Thomas showed obvious signs of psychological deterioration. During his testimony, he alternated between periods of lucidity, where he expressed deep remorse for his situation, and episodes of mental confusion, where he seemed not to completely understand what had happened to his life. That Martha had suffered multiple miscarriages over the years, a common consequence of nearby consanguinity, was also revealed by the investigation. Dr. Morrison estimated that, considering the 5 surviving children, Martha had probably been pregnant at least 10 times, with half of the pregnancies resulting in natural losses due to genetic incompatibilities. Regional attention was gained by the case when Louisville's newspapers published stories about Kentucky's most isolated family. The local community was divided between those who expressed compassion for the family's tragic situation and others who showed revulsion and demanded severe punishment. In December 1958, the decision to separate the children from their parents was made by the Bell County Court. Different care institutions for children with severe disabilities became the new homes for Sarah, David, Michael, and James. Rebecca had died 2 years earlier due to complications related to her microcephaly. In January 1959, a sentence of 15 years in prison for crimes against morals and morality, a legal terminology of the time that encompassed incestuous relationships, was given to Thomas Harrington. A 10-year sentence was received by Martha, but due to her condition as a victim of circumstances, she served only 4 years in a psychiatric institution. One of the most documented cases of consanguinity in 20th century American medical literature became the fate of the Harringtons. Admitted to Danville State Hospital, Sarah remained there until her death in 1967 at age 22 due to respiratory complications related to her congenital deformities. As prophesied by Dr. Morrison, David died in 1962 at age 15 during experimental heart surgery at the University of Louisville. Medical studies on the cardiovascular effects of close consanguinity documented his death, contributing to scientific knowledge about endogamy. Until he was 25, Michael lived, remaining in specialized institutional care. Despite his severe physical limitations, some basic communication skills were developed by him, and he showed affection for his caregivers. His death in 1974 was caused by kidney complications related to his congenital malformations. The youngest, James, surprised doctors by living until he was 31, dying in 1985. Although he never developed mental abilities beyond those of a 3-year-old, he found some quality of life at a specialized institution where he received appropriate care for the first time in his life. After the family's arrest, the Harrington property was abandoned. The wooden house rapidly deteriorated, and the land that had witnessed so much suffering began to be reclaimed by nature. Today, only the stone foundations remain visible, covered with dense vegetation that hides the physical traces of this tragedy. Social assistance policies in Kentucky were significantly influenced by the Harrington case. A national child's rights defender became Dorothy Mills, the social worker who discovered the case, and she helped establish more rigorous protocols to identify cases of neglect and consanguineous relationships in isolated rural communities. Released from prison in 1967, Thomas was never able to reintegrate into society. The last years of his life were spent in a small pension in Louisville, working manual jobs and avoiding social contact. He died in 1983 at age 56 from alcoholism-related liver cirrhosis, an escape he had found to deal with the trauma of his own life. After her release in 1963, Martha moved to a small town in Tennessee under a new identity. She worked as a housekeeper until retirement and died in 1979, taking her secrets to the grave. She never had contact with any of her surviving children after leaving the psychiatric institution. Important research on the effects of consanguinity in isolated human populations has been contributed to by the Harrington scientific legacy. Early identification protocols for endogamy-related malformations have been helped established by medical studies of the children, influencing public health policies in rural communities. A dark reminder of how isolation, distorted traditions, and extreme circumstances can lead whole families to profound degradation, this case remains. The highest possible price for traditions that prioritized blood purity over basic human well-being was paid by the Harrington family. If you have watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Subscribe to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Leave your like if this story has impacted you, and share it so that more people can know these accounts that society preferred to forget but that need to be told to understand the limits of the human condition. The legacy of the Harrington case extended far beyond the courtroom and the abandoned farm. In the years that followed, a profound re-evaluation of rural social structures was quietly undertaken by state authorities. The work of Dorothy Mills, in particular, inspired a new generation of social workers trained to look beyond surface-level explanations for family distress. Protocols for identifying signs of extreme isolation and potential consanguinity were developed and implemented across Kentucky's Appalachian region. Regular visits by health and social service officials to remote properties became mandatory, ensuring that no family could remain entirely hidden from view for decades again. A network of communication between pastors, doctors, teachers, and social workers was established, designed to piece together fragments of information that might reveal a hidden tragedy. The medical community was also deeply affected. The detailed documentation provided by Dr. Henry Morrison became a cornerstone of genetic research. In medical journals throughout the 1960s, the Harrington case was cited as an extreme but illustrative example of the rapid manifestation of deleterious recessive genes in a closed gene pool. This understanding helped genetic counselors better advise families in isolated communities about the risks of marrying within very close kinship circles. However, the personal fates of those involved remained largely tragic. After his release from prison, Thomas Harrington drifted through a life of obscurity and guilt. Haunted by the faces of his children and the weight of his forced role, he found solace only in alcohol. His death in 1983, alone in a Louisville boarding house, was a quiet end to a life defined by coercion and suffering. The local coroner's report listed cirrhosis of the liver as the primary cause, but those few who knew his history understood the true cause was a broken spirit. Martha Harrington, living under the name Mary Higgins in Tennessee, carried her own prison within her mind. Until her death in 1979, she was a quiet, withdrawn woman who never spoke of her past. Her employers knew her as a reliable but deeply sad housekeeper who flinched at sudden noises and avoided any discussion of family. The secrets of Harrington Farm died with her, a burden she carried to her grave in an unmarked plot in a small Tennessee cemetery. Of the children, only James outlived both of his parents. His life in a specialized care facility was one of basic routines and simple comforts. While he never progressed beyond the mental capacity of a toddler, caregivers noted that he responded positively to music and gentle touch. His death in 1985 closed the final chapter on the immediate Harrington family, but their story continued to resonate as a cautionary tale. The Harrington property itself became a local legend, a place teenagers dared each other to visit on moonless nights. They spoke of curses and ghosts, of hearing children's cries on the wind. The stone foundations, slowly being swallowed by the relentless Appalachian forest, served as a stark, physical monument to a darkness that can flourish in isolation. This story stands as a somber testament to the fact that some of the most profound horrors are not born of supernatural evil, but of a terrible convergence of circumstance, twisted tradition, and human vulnerability. The echoes of what happened in that secluded hollow remind us of our collective responsibility to look into the shadows, to ask difficult questions, and to extend a hand to those who may be trapped by the secrets that bind them. If this conclusion has left you reflecting, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what you believe is the most important lesson to be learned from this tragic chapter of history. And as always, subscribe for more stories that explore the forgotten corners of the human experience.